What happens when a simple pie becomes the catalyst for uncovering family secrets, healing broken hearts, and building a love that defies every expectation? Lena Hart thought she was just fighting for a job as a trail cook, but she was about to discover that some battles are worth fighting for something far greater than survival. From the dusty ranges of Wyoming territory to the tender moments that change everything, this is a story about second chances, chosen family, and the courage to love again. If you believe in the power of redemption and the strength found in unexpected places, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this tale of courage travels across the world. Now let's begin. You're My Father. Ranch hand's shocking revelation changes everything for widowed rancher. The summer of 1883 arrived in Wyoming territory like a promise wrapped in dust and determination. In the small settlement of Cedar Falls, 16-year-old Timothy Morales stood at the edge of the wooden platform, clutching a worn piece of paper with an address scrawled in his dead mother's handwriting. The morning sun cast long shadows across the frontier town, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled 8 times. His mother Maria had been gone for 3 months now, taken by the consumption that had slowly drained the life from her lungs. On her deathbed, she'd pressed this paper into his trembling hands and whispered words that had haunted him ever since. "Find your father, mijo. His name is Cade Mercer. Tell him, tell him Maria never forgot." Timothy had sold everything they owned to buy passage west. Now standing in this strange land, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a carved wooden horse his mother had made him years ago, he felt the weight of his decisions settling like stones in his stomach. "You looking for someone, son?" The voice belonged to an elderly man with kind eyes and weathered hands loading supplies into a wagon marked with the words Mercer Ranch Supply. Timothy's heart hammered against his ribs. "Yes, sir. I'm looking for Cade Mercer." The man's expression shifted, became curious. "That'd be my boss. Name's Garrett. What business you got with Mr. Mercer?" The words stuck in Timothy's throat like thorns. "How did you tell a stranger that you were searching for a father who didn't even know you existed?" It's, it's personal." Garrett studied him for a long moment, taking in Timothy's thin frame, the carefully mended patches on his shirt, the determined set of his jaw that seemed too old for his face. "Well, then I reckon you'd better come along. Ranch is about 10 miles out. You can ride in the back." As the wagon rolled through the vast prairie landscape, Timothy tried to imagine what his father might look like. Maria had spoken of Cade rarely, and always with a mixture of tenderness and regret that Timothy had never fully understood. She'd been 17 when they met, working in her family's boarding house in Kansas. He'd been a young cowhand barely older than she was, with dreams of owning land and building something permanent. "Circumstances separated us," was all Maria would say when Timothy pressed for details. "But he was a good man, mijo. Whatever else happened, remember that." The Mercer Ranch appeared gradually across the rolling hills, a collection of weathered buildings that spoke of hard work and careful planning. The main house was modest but well-maintained, surrounded by corrals where horses moved like liquid shadows in the morning light. A cookhouse sat near the bunkhouse, smoke rising from its chimney in lazy spirals that spoke of breakfast being prepared. And there, walking across the yard with the easy stride of a man comfortable with his domain, was someone who could only be Cade Mercer. Timothy felt his breath catch. The man was taller than he'd imagined, with broad shoulders and dark hair that caught the light as he moved. There was something familiar in the way he carried himself, something that made Timothy's chest tight with recognition he couldn't quite name. "Mr. Mercer!" Garrett called out as they approached. "Got someone here to see you." Cade looked up, his gaze moving from Garrett to Timothy with the assessing look of a man used to measuring strangers. Up close, Timothy could see the lines around his eyes, the weathered quality of someone who had spent years working under the sun. But it was the eyes themselves that made Timothy's world shift beneath his feet. They were the same dark brown as his own. "Help you with something." Cade's voice was measured, neither welcoming nor dismissive. Timothy climbed down from the wagon on legs that felt uncertain. This was the moment he'd imagined 1,000 times, but now that it was here, all his carefully rehearsed words seemed to crumble like dust. "My name is Timothy Morales," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My mother was Maria Esperanza Morales." For a moment, Cade went perfectly still. The color seemed to drain from his face, and Timothy saw his hands clench at his sides. Maria, Cade breathed, and in that single word, Timothy heard 17 years of buried grief and regret. She died 3 months ago. Timothy continued, pulling strength from somewhere deep inside. Before she passed, she told me to find you. She said to tell you that you have a son. The words fell between them like stones into still water, creating ripples that would change everything. Garrett made a soft sound of surprise from his position by the wagon. But Timothy only had eyes for the man standing before him, watching as understanding and shock warred across his father's features. Cade stared at him, really looked at him, and Timothy knew the moment recognition hit. The same dark eyes, the same stubborn jawline, the same way of standing with shoulders slightly tensed, as if ready for whatever the world might throw. Jesus, Cade whispered, then louder as if the word had been torn from somewhere deep inside Jesus Christ. I didn't know, Timothy said quickly, afraid that silence would somehow undo this moment. She never told me who you were until the end. Said she didn't want to complicate your life, didn't want to burden you with a responsibility you never chose. Cade's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Burden, son, you could never be a burden. The word son hit Timothy like a physical blow. Everything he dreamed of hearing wrapped up in those 3 letters. He felt his own eyes burning, but forced himself to keep speaking. She loved you, he said. Even at the end, even after all these years, she still loved you. Something broke in Cade's expression then, and he took a step forward before stopping himself, as if unsure of his right to comfort or be comforted. Where have you been all this time? Cade asked, his voice rough with emotion. What happened after she left Kansas? Timothy shrugged, trying for a casual tone that didn't quite succeed. We moved around a lot. She worked where she could find it. Boarding houses mostly, sometimes cooking for traveling crews. We ended up in Colorado for the last few years. And now she's gone. It wasn't a question, but Timothy nodded anyway. The consumption took her slow, he said quietly. She had time to tell me about you, about how young you both were, how she left because she was scared and didn't know what else to do. She regretted it every day. Cade closed his eyes for a long moment, and when he opened them again, Timothy saw a man struggling with 17 years of what-ifs and might-have-beens. You look just like her, Cade said suddenly. Around the eyes, the way you hold your head when you're thinking hard about something. Timothy felt a smile tug at the corner of his mouth, despite the tears threatening to fall. She used to say, I got your stubborn streak. That earned him a sound that might have been laughter or a sob. Yeah, that sounds about right. They stood there in the morning light, 2 strangers who shared blood and history, and a woman who had loved them both enough to bring them together even in death. Around them, the ranch continued its daily rhythm, but Timothy felt as though time had stopped just for this moment. I don't know what I'm doing, Timothy admitted. I came here because I had nowhere else to go, but also because I needed to know, to understand where I came from. And now, Timothy looked around at the ranch, at Garrett, still standing patiently by the wagon, at this man who was his father and yet a complete stranger. Now, I guess I'm hoping you'll let me stay long enough to figure out what comes next. Cade was quiet for a long moment, and Timothy held his breath, afraid that he'd asked for too much too soon. Then his father nodded slowly. There's always work for willing hands, Cade said carefully. And if you're Maria's son, you're welcome here as long as you want to stay. Relief flooded through Timothy so powerfully it made his knees weak. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Cade said, but his expression had softened. Ranch work is hard and I'm not an easy boss. You'll earn every meal and every night's shelter. I'm not afraid of hard work. Good. Garrett will show you where to bunk and get you started on morning chores. We'll talk more tonight, after supper. Timothy nodded, understanding that this was all his father could manage for now. It was enough, more than enough. As Garrett led him toward the bunkhouse, Timothy caught sight of movement near the cookhouse. A woman emerged carrying a large pot, her movements efficient and purposeful despite her generous proportions. She glanced their way, and Timothy saw curiosity flicker across her round, pleasant face. That's Miss Hart, Garrett said, following his gaze. Best cook we've had in years. Just started with us last week, and already the boys are eating better than they have since. He trailed off, seeming to realize the sensitivity of what he'd been about to say. Since when, Ian? Timothy prompted. Garrett glanced back toward where Cade stood, still staring after them, as if he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Since the boss lost his wife 3 years ago, he said quietly, this place hasn't felt much like home since then. Timothy filed this information away, another piece of his father's story that he was slowly beginning to understand. As they walked, he found himself watching the woman by the cookhouse, noting the way she moved with quiet confidence, the care with which she handled her tasks. He didn't know it yet, but Lena Hart was about to become far more important to his life than he could possibly imagine. Meanwhile, 28-year-old Lena Hart was trying very hard not to eavesdrop on the conversation taking place in the ranch yard. She'd come outside to empty the dishwater and had found herself witness to what was clearly a moment of profound significance. She'd seen enough family reunions in her years, cooking for various outfits, to recognize one when it happened. The way the rancher had gone still at the mention of the woman's name, the careful way the boy held himself as if braced for rejection, the sudden recognition that had flashed across both their faces. Father and son, she'd bet her last dollar on it. Lena had been at the Mercer Ranch for exactly 8 days, and in that time she'd learned enough about Cade Mercer to understand that this unexpected arrival would shake his carefully ordered world to its foundations. The man was still carrying the weight of his wife's death like a stone in his chest, still moving through his days with the mechanical precision of someone going through the motions of living without actually engaging with life itself. She'd seen it before, that particular kind of grief. It was the reason she'd learned to cook with extra care, to put warmth and comfort into every meal, because sometimes food was the only thing that could reach through the numbness and remind people that they were still alive. Miss Hart, Lena turned to find Garrett approaching with the young man in tow. Up close, she could see the exhaustion that clung to him like dust, the careful way he held his shoulders as if he'd been carrying weight for far longer than someone his age should have to. This here's Timothy, Garrett said. He'll be working with us for a while. Figured you might have some breakfast left if you don't mind feeding one more. Of course, Lena said, already moving toward the cookhouse. Come on in, honey. You look like you could use a good meal. Timothy followed her inside, and Lena busied herself preparing a plate while stealing glances at him from the corner of her eye. He had good bones, as her mother used to say, but he was thin in the way that spoke of too many missed meals and too much worry for someone barely old enough to shave. You've come a long way, she said, setting a plate of eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits in front of him, along with a cup of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Timothy looked at the food as if he couldn't quite believe it was real. Yes, ma'am, from Colorado. That is a long way. Lena settled across from him with her own coffee, watching as he took his first bite. The way his eyes closed in appreciation made her chest warm. Take your time. There's plenty more where that came from. They sat in comfortable silence while Timothy ate with the focused intensity of someone who hadn't had a truly satisfying meal in quite some time. Lena found herself studying his face, noting the intelligence in his dark eyes, the stubborn set of his jaw that reminded her strongly of his father. He didn't know about me, Timothy said, suddenly setting down his fork. My father. He didn't know I existed until 10 minutes ago. Lena nodded slowly. She'd suspected as much from what she'd witnessed in the yard. That must have been frightening, telling him. Terrifying, Timothy admitted. I kept thinking, what if he doesn't believe me? What if he doesn't want anything to do with me? What if I came all this way for nothing? But you told him anyway. I had to. My mother made me promise. There was something in his voice when he mentioned his mother, a grief so fresh it was still bleeding. Lena recognized it because she'd felt it herself more than once. She passed recently, Lena said gently. It wasn't a question. Timothy nodded, his throat working as if the words were stuck. 3 months ago, the consumption. I'm sorry for your loss, honey. Thank you. He picked up his fork again but didn't eat, just turned it over in his hands. She waited until the end to tell me about him. Said she didn't want to complicate his life when he probably had a family of his own by now. But he doesn't, Lena said quietly. Have a family, I mean. Not anymore. Timothy looked up at her with those dark eyes that were so much like his father's. Garrett mentioned something about a wife who died. Lena hesitated, unsure how much to say. It wasn't her place to share Cade's personal business, but this boy was his son. He had a right to understand what he was walking into. 3 years ago, she said carefully, from what I understand, it hit him hard. He's been, he's been living like a man, just going through the motions ever since. And now I show up out of nowhere and turn everything upside down. Sometimes upside down is exactly what a person needs, Lena Hart said firmly. Sometimes it's the only way to find right side up again. Timothy managed a small smile at that. You sound like my mother. She was always saying things like that. Smart woman sounds like. The smartest? She taught herself to read and write, learned to speak English so well you'd never know it wasn't her first language. She could make a feast out of nothing and always found a way to make wherever we were living feel like home. The love and admiration in his voice was clear, and Lena felt her heart squeeze with sympathy. She sounds wonderful. I would have liked to meet her. She would have liked you, Timothy said with surprising certainty. She always said the best way to judge someone's character was to watch how they treat strangers. You've been nothing but kind to me and you don't even know who I am. I know enough, Lena said softly. I know you're a young man who traveled hundreds of miles to honor his mother's dying wish. I know you're brave enough to tell a stranger he's your father and humble enough to accept whatever answer you get. That tells me plenty about your character. Timothy's eyes brightened with unshed tears. Thank you for saying that. Just telling the truth as I see it. They finished breakfast in a more comfortable silence, and Lena found herself thinking about the strange ways life brought people together. A week ago, she'd been a woman looking for work as a trail cook. Today, she was sitting with a boy who'd just found his father offering what comfort she could to someone who was essentially a stranger. But he didn't feel like a stranger. There was something about Timothy that reminded her of herself at that age, lost and alone, and trying to find a place to belong in a world that didn't always make space for people like them. Miss Hart, Timothy's voice was tentative. Could I ask you something? Of course. Do you think, do you think he'll want me to stay? Really stay, I mean. Not just for a few days until I figure out what to do next. Lena looked at this earnest young man with his father's eyes and his mother's heart and felt something shift in her chest. I think, she said carefully, that Cade Mercer is a good man who's been carrying more grief than any one person should have to bear. And I think having you here might just be the thing that helps him remember how to live again. Even though I'm a complication he never asked for. Especially because of that, Lena said with a smile. The best things in life usually are complications we never saw coming. As if summoned by their conversation, Cade's voice could be heard outside the cookhouse, calling for Garrett. Timothy stiffened slightly, and Lena reached across the table to squeeze his hand. It's going to be all right, she said with more confidence than she felt. Give him time to adjust. Finding out you have a son isn't the kind of thing a man gets used to in one morning. Timothy nodded and stood carrying his empty plate to the wash basin with the automatic courtesy of someone who'd been taught to clean up after himself. Thank you for breakfast, and for listening. Anytime, honey. That's what family does. The words slipped out before Lena could stop it, and she felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. Timothy wasn't her family. She was just the cook, a temporary employee who would move on when the season ended just like she always did. But Timothy smiled and the expression transformed his entire face. Family, he repeated softly as if testing the weight of the word. I like the sound of that. After he left, Lena stood alone in her cookhouse and tried to ignore the way her heart had started beating just a little faster. She'd been in Wyoming territory for barely more than a week, but already she could feel something shifting inside her, the wall she'd built around her heart, developing hairline cracks that let in dangerous amounts of hope. She was going to have to be careful. Hope was a luxury she'd learned not to indulge in because hope led to disappointment, and disappointment led to the kind of pain that could cripple a woman in her position. But as she began preparing for the midday meal, Lena found herself humming under her breath, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the future felt like it might hold something worth looking forward to. Outside, she could hear Cade's voice giving Timothy instructions about morning chores, patient but reserved. Father and son learning to navigate the space between them with the careful politeness of strangers who shared something profound but didn't yet know what to do with it. Lena smiled and added an extra measure of care to her preparations. They were all going to need their strength for whatever came next. By evening, word had spread through the small community that Cade Mercer had acquired a son. News traveled fast in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the arrival of Timothy Morales was the kind of development that had tongues wagging from the general store to the church steps. Lena became aware of this when Mrs. Adelaide Pritchard arrived at the ranch just as she was finishing the supper preparations. The woman swept into the cookhouse without invitation, her sharp eyes taking inventory of every pot and pan. "Miss Hart," Mrs. Pritchard said with a kind of smile that never reached her eyes, "I heard we had quite the excitement here today." "If you say so," Lena replied carefully, not pausing in her work. "A long-lost son appearing out of nowhere. How dramatic." Mrs. Pritchard settled herself at the table as if she'd been invited to stay. "I must say I'm curious about the timing. I'm not sure I follow." "Well, it's interesting. Don't you think this boy shows up just as Cade is preparing for the summer drive? Just as he's hired a new cook and is making changes to his operation? One might wonder if there's more to this story than meets the eye." Lena's hands stilled on the spoon she'd been using to stir the stew. "Are you suggesting something, Mrs. Pritchard?" "Oh, heavens, no. I'm simply observing that life has a way of presenting us with convenient complications, doesn't it? Especially when there's money involved." The implication hit Lena like a physical blow. "You think that boy is lying about being Cade's son?" "I think," Mrs. Pritchard said with delicate precision, "that a young man with no family and no prospects might see an opportunity in a lonely widower with a successful ranch. And I think a clever woman might see an even bigger opportunity in facilitating such a convenient reunion." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, and Lena felt her temper begin to rise. "Are you accusing me of something?" "I'm simply suggesting that perhaps someone with your background might be particularly sympathetic to a young man in need of a family. Birds of a feather, as they say." Lena set down her spoon very carefully, fighting the urge to dump the contents of the pot over Mrs. Pritchard's perfectly coiffed head. "My background? Well, unmarried, no family of your own, constantly moving from one temporary position to another. It must be lonely. I could see how you might want to create some sort of permanent situation for yourself." The words were delivered with such poisonous sweetness that it took Lena a moment to process their full meaning. When she did, the fury that rose in her chest was so pure, it left her momentarily breathless. "Get out," she said quietly. "I beg your pardon. I said get out of my kitchen." Lena's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking with the effort to control herself. "Right now, Mrs." Pritchard rose with injured dignity. "I'm only thinking of Cade's best interests. That poor man has been through enough without being taken advantage of by opportunists and charlatans." "Out!" Mrs. Pritchard swept toward the door, then paused at the threshold. "Mark my words, Miss Hart. Whatever game you're playing here, whatever you think you stand to gain, it won't work. This community protects its own, and we don't take kindly to outsiders who try to manipulate their way into situations above their station." After she left, Lena stood alone in the sudden quiet, her heart pounding with anger, and something that felt dangerously close to fear. She'd encountered women like Adelaide Pritchard before, women who wielded social position like a weapon and saw threats in anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of acceptable. But this felt different, more personal, more dangerous. Through the window, she could see Cade and Timothy working together to secure the evening feed, their movements still awkward around each other, but no longer completely foreign. They were trying, both of them, to build something from the ruins of 17 lost years. And Adelaide Pritchard wanted to destroy it before it even had a chance to begin. Lena turned back to her stove with renewed determination. She'd faced down skeptical ranch hands, harsh weather supply shortages, and every other challenge that came with her chosen profession. She could handle one spiteful woman with delusions of authority. The question was whether she'd be able to protect Timothy and Cade from the damage such a woman could do if she really set her mind to it. As if summoned by her thoughts, Timothy appeared in the doorway, his face flushed from the day's work, but his eyes bright with something that looked like contentment. "Miss Hart," Garrett said, "supper was ready." "Just about," Lena said, forcing her voice to sound normal. "How was your first day?" "Hard," Timothy admitted, settling at the table. "But good, really good. He's not what I expected." "How so?" Akdishi, quieter, more careful with his words. "But patient, you know. He showed me how to properly care for the horses, and he didn't make me feel stupid when I made mistakes." The love and hope in Timothy's voice made Lena's chest tight with protective instincts she had no right to feel. I'm glad. He asked about my mother, Timothy continued, wanted to know what her life was like after she left Kansas. I told him about the places we lived, the work she did. He listened to every word like it was the most important thing he'd ever heard. It probably was. Timothy nodded, then looked up at her with sudden uncertainty. Miss Hart, can I ask you something that might sound strange? Of course. Do you think it's possible to love someone you've never met? I mean, really love them, not just the idea of them. Lena considered the question carefully. Why do you ask? Because I think he loved her. My mother. Even after all these years, even not knowing what happened to her, I think he never stopped loving her. And I think she felt the same way about him. What makes you say that? Timothy was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his hands. The way she talked about him when she thought I wasn't listening. Like he was someone she'd lost but never forgotten. And today when I told him she was gone, he looked like someone had torn something vital right out of his chest. Lena felt tears prick at her eyes. Then yes, I think it's possible. Love doesn't always require presence. Sometimes it's built on shared dreams and what-ifs and the kind of connection that transcends time and distance. That's what I thought too. Timothy smiled sadly. I wish they could have found their way back to each other. I think they would have been happy. Maybe, Lena said gently, but they found a way to create you, and through you they found a way to be connected again. Sometimes that's how love works. It finds a way even when everything seems impossible. Timothy's eyes brightened with unshed tears. You really think so? I know so. As if drawn by their conversation, Kate appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes warm when they landed on Timothy. Everything ready, he asked. Just waiting for the hands to wash up. Lena replied, ladling stew into serving bowls. Should be any minute now. Cade nodded and moved to help her carry dishes to the table, their movements around each other beginning to develop the easy rhythm that came from shared work. As they worked, Lena became acutely aware of him in ways that had nothing to do with the practical necessities of meal service. The way he moved with unconscious grace despite his size. The careful gentleness with which he handled everything, as if he'd learned not to trust his own strength. The way his eyes kept drifting to Timothy when he thought no one was looking, wonder and grief and cautious hope warring across his features. This was a man learning how to want something again, learning how to hope. And Lena found herself desperately wanting to protect that fragile new growth from whatever poison Adelaide Pritchard was planning to spread. The hands began filing in for supper, their voices filling the cookhouse with the comfortable noise of men who'd worked hard and were ready for a good meal. They greeted Timothy with the easy acceptance of people who understood that ranch life was always adding and subtracting members of the community. But Lena noticed the way some of their eyes lingered on the boy, the subtle way conversations shifted when he passed by. Word of his connection to Cade was spreading, and with it would come questions, speculation, and potentially the kind of talk that could make life uncomfortable for everyone involved. As she served the men, Lena caught fragments of whispered conversations. Spitting image of the boss when he was that age. Wonder where the boy's been all this time. Mighty convenient timing if you ask me. That last comment came from Hayes, a ranch hand who'd been with Cade for years, but had never quite lost the chip on his shoulder that came from being passed over for foreman positions. He was the kind of man who saw conspiracy and coincidence and took pleasure in stirring up trouble wherever he could find it. Lena made a mental note to keep an eye on him. Men like Hayes were dangerous when they smelled opportunity for advancement or revenge. Supper passed without major incident, though Lena noticed the careful way Cade and Timothy navigated around each other, still learning the boundaries of their new relationship. They sat together but not too close, spoke politely, but without the easy familiarity that would come with time and trust. It was like watching two people learn a new dance, Lena thought, both trying to find the rhythm without stepping on each other's feet. After the meal, as the hands drifted back to the bunkhouse and their evening routines, Cade lingered in the cookhouse, while Timothy helped Lena with the dishes. You don't have to do that, Lena told the boy. Cleaning up is my job. My mother always said idle hands were the devil's playground. Timothy replied with a grin that transformed his serious face. Besides, it feels good to have something useful to do. Cade watched his son with an expression of such profound tenderness that it made Lena's chest ache. Whatever doubts he might have had about Timothy's identity had clearly been laid to rest by a day spent observing the boy's mannerisms, his work ethic, his unconscious habits that spoke of shared blood. "Timothy," Cade said carefully, "I was thinking, if you're going to be staying for a while, we should probably talk about arrangements. The bunkhouse is fine for now, but eventually," he trailed off clearly, unsure how to navigate the complexities of suddenly acquiring a nearly grown son. "Eventually," Timothy prompted. "Eventually, you might want your own space. There's a small cabin on the property, not much more than one room, but it's private. Needs some work, but if you're interested." The hope that flashed across Timothy's face was so bright it was almost painful to witness. "You'd let me stay. Really stay." "This is your home," Cade said simply. "It always was. I just didn't know you needed it." Timothy set down the plate he'd been drying with hands that trembled slightly. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. Just think about it. No pressure." But the decision was already made. Lena could see it in the boy's eyes. He'd found his father and his father had offered him a home. Everything else was just details. "I'd like that," Timothy said quietly. "I'd like that very much." Cade nodded, clearly relieved. "Good. We can start working on it this weekend. Get it cleaned up, make it livable." "I can help," Lena found herself saying. Both men turned to look at her, and she felt her cheeks warm. "I mean, if you need help with cleaning or anything domestic, I have some experience making places feel like home." "That's kind of you," Cade said, and something in his voice made her look up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I'd appreciate that." Timothy looked between them with the perceptive gaze of someone who'd learned early to read the undercurrents in adult relationships. "It would be nice to have help from someone who knows about making things comfortable. My mother was good at that, but I never really learned the knack." The mention of his mother cast a brief shadow over the conversation, but it wasn't the sharp pain of fresh grief. Instead, it felt like the gentle sadness of someone learning to carry loss without being crushed by it. "She would have liked seeing you here," Kate said softly, "seeing you settled somewhere safe." "I think so too," Timothy agreed. "She always worried about what would happen to me if something happened to her. Now I guess she doesn't have to worry anymore." The simple faith in his voice made Lena's throat tight with emotion. This boy had lost his mother and found his father in the space of 3 months. He was handling it with a grace that spoke well of both his character and the woman who'd raised him. "Well," she said briskly, needing to break the emotional tension before she started crying right there in her own kitchen. "I should let you both get some rest. Tomorrow's another big day." "Thank you," Cade said, "for supper and for making him feel welcome." "He's good company," Lena replied honestly, "and he's got good hands for kitchen work if you ever want to loan him out for meal prep." Timothy grinned. "I'd like that. My mother taught me some basics, but I'd love to learn more." "Then it's settled," Lena said. "You can help me with breakfast tomorrow if you're up early enough." "I'll be here," Timothy promised. After they left, Lena finished her evening routine with a lighter heart than she'd carried in months. There was something about watching a family form that made even the most cynical heart believe in second chances. But as she banked the fire and prepared to retire to her small room attached to the cookhouse, Adelaide Pritchard's words echoed in her mind like a warning bell. "This community protects its own, and we don't take kindly to outsiders who try to manipulate their way into situations above their station." Lena had faced down skeptical communities before, but she'd also learned that there was a difference between healthy suspicion and active malice. Mrs. Pritchard's visit had carried the scent of something darker, more deliberate than simple concern for Cade's welfare. As she settled into her narrow bed and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into sleep, Lena found herself making a silent promise to the woman whose dying wish had brought Timothy here. Whatever Adelaide Pritchard had planned, whatever poison she wanted to spread about this newfound family, Lena would be ready for her. Some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight wasn't technically yours. And watching Cade Mercer learn to hope again, watching Timothy Morales discover what it meant to belong somewhere, those were definitely things worth fighting for. 2 weeks passed like pages turning in a book of gradually changing seasons. Timothy settled into ranch life with the adaptability of someone who'd learned early that home was what you made of any place willing to accept you. His days began before dawn in Lena's cookhouse, where she taught him the subtle arts of bread making and the precise timing required to feed 30 hungry men without burning a single biscuit. The secret, Lena explained one morning, as they worked together in the pre-dawn darkness, is to think of cooking as a conversation. You listen to what the fire tells you, what the dough tells you, what the meat tells you. Everything has its own voice if you pay attention. Timothy nodded, concentrating intensely as he kneaded the day's bread. His hands, still soft from his previous life, were beginning to develop the calluses that spoke of honest work. My mother used to say something similar about sewing. She said the fabric would tell you how it wanted to be shaped. Smart woman, Lena murmured, watching the boy's technique improve with each passing day. He had natural instincts for the work, an intuitive understanding of heat and timing that couldn't be taught. She was, Timothy agreed, then glanced up at Lena with a small smile. You remind me of her sometimes, the way you make everyone feel taken care of. The comment hit Lena squarely in the chest, warming places she'd forgotten existed. That's quite a compliment. It's the truth. As the days accumulated, Lena watched the careful dance between father and son begin to evolve into something more natural. Cade still carried himself with the reserved politeness of a man unsure of his rights to affection, but she could see the barrier slowly crumbling. Timothy, for his part, approached his father with the patient persistence of someone who understood that trust was earned in small increments. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday when Timothy fell from a spooked horse and landed hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. Lena was hanging laundry when it happened, and she heard Cade's sharp cry of alarm from across the yard. By the time she reached them, Cade was kneeling beside Timothy with all his careful reserve completely abandoned. His hands shook as he checked the boy for injuries, and his voice was raw with panic. Can you move? Does anything feel broken? Jesus, Timothy, you scared the hell out of me. Timothy, who was mostly just bruised and embarrassed, looked up at his father with wonder. You were scared. Of course I was scared, Cade said, helping him sit up carefully. You're my son. The simple declaration hung in the rain-washed air like a benediction. Timothy's eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with his fall, and Lena felt her own throat tighten with emotion. I'm okay, Timothy said quietly, but I'm glad you were scared, if that makes sense. Cade understood. Lena could see it in the way his expression softened, the way he reached out to touch Timothy's face with a gentleness that spoke of feelings too big for words. It makes perfect sense, he said. Come on, let's get you cleaned up. Watching them walk toward the house together, Cade's hand steady on Timothy's shoulder, Lena felt something shift in her own heart. This wasn't just a story about a boy finding his father anymore. It was about a man learning to let himself love again, learning that his heart was strong enough to risk being broken. That evening, as she prepared supper, Lena found herself humming again. The sound surprised her because she hadn't realized she was doing it. But something about the ranch felt different now, warmer somehow, as if the building of one relationship was strengthening all the others. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear anyone approach until a voice spoke from directly behind her. You seem happy. Lena spun around to find Cade standing in the doorway, his shoulder leaning against the frame in a way that it suggested he'd been watching her for a while. Oh, she said, pressing a hand to her racing heart. You startled me. Sorry, you just looked. He paused, seeming to search for words. Content, I suppose. It's nice to see. Lena felt heat rise in her cheeks. Well, it's been a good day. Timothy's doing well with the cooking lessons, and his fall wasn't as serious as it could have been. No, it wasn't. Cade stepped into the cookhouse proper, moving with that careful grace she'd begun to notice more and more. Thanks to your quick thinking getting to him so fast. You were the one who took care of him. We both did, Cade said simply, and something in his tone made Lena look up to meet his eyes. They were standing closer than strictly necessary, she realized. Close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the small scar on his left temple that spoke of some long-ago accident. Close enough to smell the clean scent of soap and honest work that seemed to follow him everywhere. Lena, he said, and her name sounded different in his voice than it ever had before. Softer, more personal. Yes. I want you to know how grateful I am for everything you have done for Timothy, for the way you've made him feel welcome here. He's easy to care about. So are you, Cade said quietly, and the words fell between them like stones dropped into still water. Lena's breath caught in her throat. Cade, but whatever she might have said was interrupted by the sound of approaching voices. The hands were coming in for supper, and the moment that had been building between them dissolved like sugar in rain. Cade stepped back, the careful reserve sliding over his features like a mask. I should let you finish preparing. Yes, Lena managed, though her hands were shaking as she turned back to her stove. Of course. He left without another word, and Lena was left alone with her racing heart and the dangerous warmth spreading through her chest. She'd been careful not to read too much into his kindness as his respect for her work. She told herself that gratitude wasn't the same thing as affection, that shared concern for Timothy didn't mean anything more than basic human decency. But the way he'd said her name, the way he'd looked at her just now, don't, she told herself firmly, don't start hoping for things that can't be. But even as she tried to push the moment from her mind, she found herself touching the spot where his breath had warmed her cheek, wondering what might have happened if they hadn't been interrupted. 3 days later, Lena was cleaning out the small storage room attached to the cookhouse when she found the wooden box hidden beneath a pile of old grain sacks. It was beautifully made, carved from what looked like cherry wood and fitted with a brass latch that had tarnished with age. She probably should have left it alone. Whatever was inside clearly wasn't meant for casual discovery. But something about the way it had been hidden, not just stored but deliberately concealed, made her curious enough to lift the lid. Inside, nestled in folds of yellowed tissue paper, were letters, dozens of them tied with ribbon and written in the careful script of someone for whom English was not a first language. The return address on the topmost letter made Lena's breath catch. Maria E. Morales, Colorado territory. Timothy's mother had written to Cade, for years by the look of it. Lena's first instinct was to close the box and pretend she'd never found it. These were private communications not meant for outside eyes. But as she started to replace the lid, her gaze fell on the date of the uppermost letter, December 1882. Just 4 months ago, just 1 month before Maria's death. The knowledge that Timothy's mother had been reaching out to Cade so recently that she died knowing her letters existed, but apparently believing them unread, was more than Lena could bear to leave unexamined. With hands that trembled slightly, she opened the most recent letter. My dearest Cade, I know these letters may never reach you, or if they do, you may choose not to read them. I cannot blame you if that is the case. 17 years is a long time to carry anger, and I know I gave you every reason to be angry with me. But I am dying, and there are things I need you to know before I go. About why I left, about our son, about the life he has lived and the man he is becoming. His name is Timothy, and he has your eyes, your stubbornness, and your gentle heart. He is the best thing I ever did in this world, and he is yours as much as he is mine. I have never told him this, but every day I see you in his face, in the careful way he considers problems before acting in his instinct to protect those weaker than himself. I left Kansas because I was young and scared and convinced that love, without security, was a cruelty I couldn't inflict on either of us. You had dreams of owning land, building something permanent, and I was just a girl with no dowry and no prospects beyond the calluses on my hands. I thought I was saving you from a burden you were too honorable to refuse. I was wrong. I see that now when it's too late to change anything. Love is its own security, isn't it? Love is what makes everything else worth building. I named him Timothy because it means honoring God, and I wanted him to understand that some gifts are too precious to question. You were my gift, Cade. Those months we had together were the happiest of my life, and Timothy is the proof that even the briefest happiness can create something lasting and beautiful. If you are reading this, it means I found the courage to send these letters before the consumption takes me entirely. It means I finally chose honesty over pride. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't expect answers. I just need you to know that you have a son who is everything good about both of us. Find him if you can. Love him if you will. He needs a father, and you deserve to know the joy of being his. With all the love a foolish woman has to give, Maria Lena set the letter down with hands that shook so violently she could barely control them. The pain in those words, the regret and love and desperate hope, hit her like a physical blow. This woman had died believing she was reaching across 17 years of silence to reconnect the two people she loved most in the world. But if the letters were here, hidden in Cade's storage room, why hadn't he responded? Why hadn't he gone to find Timothy before circumstances forced the boy to find him? With growing dread, Lena opened in the second letter, then the third. As she read, a picture began to emerge that made her stomach twist with something between rage and heartbreak. The letters had been intercepted. Every single one of them had been opened before reaching Cade Reid by someone else, then hidden away without his knowledge. The postmarks spanned 3 years, starting not long after his wife Sarah's death. Someone had been systematically preventing Maria's letters from reaching their intended recipient, someone who had access to his mail, someone who had been in a position to intercept correspondence without arousing suspicion. As if summoned by her growing horror, voices approached the cookhouse from outside. Lena quickly gathered the letters back into their box and closed the lid, her mind racing. She needed time to think, to decide what to do with this devastating knowledge. But as she moved to hide the box again, one of the voices outside became clear enough to identify. "Told you from the beginning this was a mistake. Letting that woman stay here, letting her influence him. And now, look what's happened." Adelaide Pritchard. Her voice carried clearly through the thin walls of the cookhouse. "I understand your concerns," came Cade's voice, measured, but with an edge of irritation. "But Timothy is my son, and Lena is what, a woman you've known for 3 weeks, a drifter who showed up just in time to facilitate this convenient reunion." Lena pressed herself against the wall beside the window, hardly daring to breathe. "I won't have you speaking about her that way," Cade said, and the warning in his voice was unmistakable. "Oh, Cade, can't you see what's happening here? This woman has manipulated you into taking in a boy who may or may not be your son, and now she's positioning herself as the perfect little homemaker. It's quite clever, really. Timothy is my son. There's no question about that. Based on what his word, a resemblance that could be coincidence, have you asked yourself why this mysterious Maria never contacted you before? Why she waited until she was dying to suddenly develop a conscience about keeping your so-called child from you?" The lies rolled off Adelaide's tongue with the smooth confidence of someone who believed her own deceptions. Lena felt sick listening to them, knowing the truth that lay hidden in the wooden box. "Even if that were true," Kate said carefully, "it wouldn't change anything. Timothy is here now. He's my responsibility. And what about when this cook of yours gets tired of playing house? What happens to that boy when she moves on to her next opportunity? Because she will, Cade. Women like that always do." "Women like what?" The dangerous quiet in Cade's voice should have warned Adelaide to tread more carefully, but she pressed on with the ruthless persistence of someone convinced of her own rightness. "You know exactly what I mean. Unmarried women of a certain age who've made careers out of taking care of other people's families. They're always looking for something permanent, something that will give them security and respectability. And you, with your ranch and your broken heart, and now your convenient child, you're exactly the kind of opportunity such a woman would seize." Lena closed her eyes against the pain of hearing her own fears spoken aloud with such cruel clarity. Because wasn't there a grain of truth in Adelaide's accusations? Hadn't she felt herself hoping for exactly the kind of permanence Adelaide described? "You're wrong about her," Kate said firmly. "Am I? Have you asked yourself why she's been so eager to help with Timothy, so quick to make herself indispensable to both of you? Mark my words, within a month she'll be suggesting that what this family really needs is a proper wife and mother. And you, grateful and lonely as you are, will convince yourself it's love. That's enough. I'm trying to protect you, Cade, the same way I tried to protect you from being hurt when—" Adelaide's voice cut off abruptly, as if she'd realized she was about to say something she shouldn't. "When what?" Cade's voice was deadly quiet. "Nothing. I hate seeing you make the same mistakes twice." "What mistakes?" But Adelaide had clearly decided she'd said too much. "I should go, but please think about what I've said. Think about the timing of all this. Ask yourself who really benefits from this sudden family reunion." Lena heard the sound of footsteps departing, then silence. She waited several minutes before daring to peer out the window, but both Cade and Adelaide were gone. Alone again with the box of letters and the poisonous words she'd overheard, Lena sank into a chair and tried to make sense of what she'd learned. Maria had been trying to contact Cade for years. Her letters had been intercepted and hidden. Someone had deliberately prevented Timothy's parents from finding each other. And Adelaide Pritchard seemed to know more about it than she was willing to admit. The sound of approaching footsteps made Lena quickly hide the box again, but it was only Timothy who appeared in the doorway, his face bright with the unconscious happiness that had become his default expression since arriving at the ranch. Miss Hart, I was wondering if you might have time to show me how you make those little sweet rolls. The ones you served last Sunday, my father mentioned how much he liked them, and I thought maybe Timothy's voice trailed off as he took in her expression. Are you all right? You look pale. Lena forced herself to smile, though it felt like her face might crack from the effort. I'm fine, honey, just a little tired. Are you sure you look like you've seen a ghost? In a way, Lena thought I have. I'm sure, she said aloud. And of course, I can show you how to make the sweet rolls. Why don't we start on those now? Timothy brightened immediately, the worry sliding from his features with the resilience of youth. Really? That would be wonderful. As they worked together, mixing and kneading and shaping the delicate pastries, Lena tried to focus on the simple pleasure of teaching someone who genuinely wanted to learn. But her mind kept returning to Maria's letters, to Adelaide's accusations, to the growing certainty that forces beyond her control were moving to destroy the fragile happiness that had been building at the Mercer Ranch. Miss Hart, Timothy's voice was tentative. Can I tell you something? Of course. I've never been this happy before. I know that probably sounds strange, given that my mother just died and I'm still getting used to having a father, but he paused, searching for words, while his hands continued their practice motions. It's like I've been holding my breath my whole life, and now I can finally exhale. Does that make sense? Lena's throat tightened with emotion. It makes perfect sense. I know this is all temporary, Timothy continued, apparently needing to voice thoughts he'd been carrying alone. I know Miss Hart probably has other jobs lined up after the summer, and I know my father and I are still figuring out how to be a family. But right now, in this moment, everything feels perfect, Lena suggested softly. Yes, perfect. Timothy smiled with the unconscious radiance of someone who had found exactly where they belonged. I wish my mother could see this. I wish she could know that her plan worked, that bringing us together was exactly what we all needed. The innocent trust in his voice made Lena's heart break a little more. This boy had no idea that his mother had been trying to bring them together for years, that her plan had been thwarted by someone who had their own agenda. Someone who was still working to tear apart what Maria had died hoping to create. Timothy, Lena said carefully, what would you do if someone tried to convince your father that you weren't really his son? Timothy's hands stilled in their work. What do you mean? I mean hypothetically, if someone spread rumors or raised questions about your identity, how would you handle that? The boy was quiet for a long moment, his young face growing serious. I'd tell the truth, he said finally. I'd trust that the truth was strong enough to stand up to whatever lies people wanted to tell. Even if the lies were more convenient than the truth. Even if they came from people with influence and standing in the community. Timothy met her eyes with a steadiness that reminded her powerfully of his father. Especially then. My mother always said that lies might be easier in the short term, but truth is what lasts. Truth is what you can build a life on. The simple faith in his words made Lena's decision for her. Whatever the consequences, Timothy and Kay deserved to know the truth about Maria's letters. They deserved to understand that her silence hadn't been indifference, that her love had been reaching for them across the years, even when it couldn't quite bridge the distance. And Adelaide Pritchard, whoever she really was, and whatever her motivations might be, deserved to face the consequences of the pain she'd caused. Timothy, Lena said quietly, there's something I need to show you. Something about your mother. The box felt heavier as she retrieved it from its hiding place, weighted with all the lost years and missed opportunities it represented. Timothy's eyes widened as she set it on the table between them. What is it? Letters, Lena said simply. From your mother to your father. Letters he never received. Timothy's face went very still. What do you mean he never received them? I mean someone intercepted them. Someone who had access to his mail. Someone who didn't want your parents to reconnect. With hands that trembled slightly, Timothy opened the box and lifted out the topmost letter. His eyes moved quickly over the words, and Lena watched as understanding dawned across his features. She was writing to him, he whispered. All this time she was trying to reach him. For years, Lena confirmed. Look at the dates. Timothy sorted through the letters with growing amazement and anger. Some of these are from when I was just a baby. She's been trying to contact him my whole life. Not your whole life, Lena said gently. She waited until after his wife died. I think she was trying to respect his marriage. But after that, God, some of these are just months old. She was still writing to him even when she was sick. Timothy's voice broke on the last words, and Lena reached across the table to cover his hand with her own. She loved you both so much, she said quietly. You can see it in every word. He would have come for us, Timothy said with absolute certainty. If he'd gotten these letters, he would have come to Colorado. He would have brought us back here. I believe that too. Timothy was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the implications of what they'd discovered. When he spoke again, his voice was hard with an anger Lena had never heard from him before. Who did this? Who kept these from him? I don't know for certain, Lena said carefully, but I have suspicions. Before she could elaborate, the sound of footsteps approached the cookhouse. Both of them tensed, but it was only Cade who appeared in the doorway, his face lighting up at the sight of them working together. Something smells good in here, he said, then stopped as he took in their expressions. Is everything all right? Timothy looked at Lena, a question in his eyes. She nodded slightly. Father, Timothy said, and the words still carried the slight hesitation of newness. There's something you need to see. Cade's gaze moved from Timothy to the box on the table, and something in his expression shifted. What is it? Timothy stood and held out one of the letters. It's from my mother. They're all from my mother. Cade took the letter with hands that had gone completely still. His eyes moved over the paper, and Lena watched as the color drained from his face. Where did these come from? His voice was barely above a whisper. I found them hidden in the storage room, Lena said quietly. Hidden, not stored. Someone didn't want you to see them. Cade sank into a chair as if his legs would no longer support him, the letter trembling in his hands. She was trying to reach me. For years, Timothy said, his voice thick with emotion. Look at the dates. Cade sorted through the letters with the careful attention of someone handling something precious and fragile. As he read, tears began to track silently down his face. I thought she didn't want anything to do with me, he said finally. I thought she'd decided I wasn't worth finding. All this time, she loved you, Timothy said simply. She never stopped loving you. And I never knew. Cade's voice broke on the words. God, I never knew. Lena watched father and son sit together with the weight of revelation settling around them like snow. There would be questions later, investigations into who had intercepted the letters and why. There would be anger and probably conflict with whoever was responsible. But right now, in this moment, there was simply the truth. Maria had loved them both. She had died trying to bring them together. And now, finally, her words had found their way home. She would be so happy, Timothy said softly, knowing that we found each other anyway, knowing that her plan worked even if it took longer than she hoped. Cade looked up at his son with eyes bright with tears and something that looked like wonder. She'd be proud of you, the man you've become, the courage it took to come here and find me. I had a good teacher, Timothy replied. She always said that love finds a way even when everything seems impossible. As if drawn by some invisible force, both men looked at Lena. She felt their gratitude like a weight warm and precious and slightly overwhelming. Thank you, Cade said quietly, for finding these, for making sure we knew the truth. Everyone deserves to know they were loved, Lena replied simply, especially when that love was strong enough to last 17 years. But even as she spoke the words, Adelaide Pritchard's accusations echoed in her mind like a discordant note in a symphony. Because now that the truth about the letters was known, someone was going to have to answer for their disappearance. Someone was going to have to explain why they'd been hidden instead of delivered. And Lena had a growing suspicion that those answers were going to change everything for all of them. Outside, the first shadows of evening were beginning to stretch across the ranch yard, and in the distance, she could hear the hands finishing their daily work. Soon they'd be coming in for supper, and life would resume its normal rhythm. But nothing would ever be quite the same. The truth once released had a way of reshaping everything around it, and the truth that Maria Morales had never stopped loving Cade Mercer, had never stopped trying to bring their family together, was going to have consequences that none of them could yet imagine. Lena only hoped that those consequences would prove to be the kind that built rather than destroyed, the kind that healed rather than wounded. Because watching Cade and Timothy discover their mother's love through her own words, seeing them begin to understand the full scope of what they'd lost and found was almost too beautiful to bear. Some truths were worth fighting for no matter what the petites, and this Lena was beginning to realize was one of them. The morning after the letter's discovery dawned gray and heavy with the promise of storm. Lena woke before her usual time, pulled from sleep by an uneasiness she couldn't quite name. Through her small window, she could see clouds building on the western horizon, dark and pregnant with rain that would either bless the parched earth or turn the ranch roads to impassable mud. She dressed quickly and made her way to the cookhouse, but she wasn't the first one awake. Timothy sat at the table fully dressed, staring down at one of his mother's letters with the intense concentration of someone trying to memorize every word. "Couldn't sleep either?" Lena asked softly. Timothy looked up and she saw that his eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion and grief. "I keep thinking about all the time we lost, all the years when we could have been together if someone hadn't." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, but Lena understood. The betrayal of trust, the deliberate cruelty of keeping a family separated, was almost too much to comprehend. "Your mother wouldn't want you to torture yourself with what-ifs," Lena said, gently settling across from him with 2 cups of coffee. "She'd want you to focus on what you have now." "I know, but it's hard not to wonder what our lives might have been like if my father had gotten these letters when I was small. If we'd grown up here on the ranch, if my mother hadn't had to struggle so hard just to keep us fed and housed." Timothy's voice carried the weight of years of watching his mother work herself to exhaustion, years of moving from one temporary situation to another, always searching for stability that remained just out of reach. "She did the best she could with what she had," Lena said firmly, "and she raised you to be exactly the kind of person your father would be proud to call his son. That's not something that happened by accident." Timothy managed a small smile. "You sound like her sometimes. The way you always find something positive to say, even when things look impossible." "Well, I've learned that hope is usually more useful than despair. Doesn't solve everything, but it gives you the strength to keep trying until you find what does." Before Timothy could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their quiet conversation. Through the window, Lena could see a group of riders approaching the ranch house, their pace urgent despite the early hour. "That's Sheriff Morrison," Timothy said, standing to get a better view, "and Mrs. Pritchard, and—" His face darkened. "Hayes." Lena's stomach clenched with sudden dread. Hayes had been fired from the ranch 3 weeks ago after being caught stealing supplies, but seeing him now with the sheriff and Adelaide Pritchard felt like the convergence of forces that meant nothing good. "Go find your father," Lena said quietly. "Quickly." Timothy disappeared without question, and Lena forced herself to continue her morning preparations despite the growing knot in her stomach. Whatever was about to happen, she had a feeling she was going to need all the normalcy she could maintain. She was ladling batter onto the griddle when voices approached the cookhouse. Through the doorway, she could see Cade standing in the yard with Sheriff Morrison, their conversation too low to hear, but the tension in both men's postures clearly visible. Adelaide Pritchard stood slightly apart from them, her expression composed, but her eyes bright with something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction. Hayes lingered near the horses, and even from a distance, Lena could see the sullen resentment that had always marked his interactions with anyone in authority. The conversation continued for several minutes, punctuated by gestures toward the house, the bunkhouse, and finally the cookhouse itself. Lena's hands continued their practiced motions, but her attention was entirely focused on the scene outside. Finally, the group began moving in her direction. Cade's face was carved from stone, his jaw set in the way that meant he was holding back anger through sheer force of will. Sheriff Morrison looked uncomfortable, but determined, like a man doing something distasteful but necessary. "Miss Hart," the sheriff's voice was polite but formal as he stepped into the cookhouse. "I'm Sheriff Morrison. I wonder if I might have a word with you." "Of course," Lena said, setting down her spatula and turning to face him fully. "What can I do for you?" "Well, we've received some serious allegations regarding recent events here at the ranch. Allegations that I'm obligated to investigate." Lena's gaze flicked to Adelaide, who was watching from the doorway with barely concealed triumph. "What kind of allegations?" "Mrs. Pritchard has reason to believe that you may have been involved in a conspiracy to defraud Mr. Mercer. Specifically that you assisted a young man in fabricating evidence of a family connection in order to gain access to the ranch and its resources. The words hit Lena like a physical blow, but she forced herself to remain calm. And what evidence does Mrs. Pritchard have for these accusations? Hayes stepped forward, his face twisted with the vindictive pleasure of someone settling old scores. I seen you with that box of letters before the boy ever claimed to find them. Seen you working on them, writing things, changing things around. That's a lie, Lena said flatly. Is it awful convenient how them letters just happened to turn up right when you needed to prove the boy's story? Awful convenient how you just happened to be the one to find them. Sheriff Morrison looked deeply uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, but he pressed on with the dogged persistence of a man following procedure. Mrs. Pritchard also suggests that you may have had financial motivations for facilitating this alleged deception. Financial motivations. Adelaide stepped into the cookhouse, her expression a perfect mask of concerned citizenship. My dear, no one blames you for wanting security. A woman in your position, unmarried and without family, always moving from one temporary job to another. It would be only natural to see an opportunity in a lonely widower with a prosperous ranch. The poisonous words were delivered with such gentle sympathy that they almost sounded like kindness. Almost. You're suggesting that I forged correspondence between Timothy's mother and Cade in order to... Lena paused, hardly able to believe she was having this conversation. In order to what exactly trick them into developing a relationship so I could somehow benefit from it? It's not unheard of, Adelaide said with delicate regret. Women of your background have been known to use whatever means necessary to secure their futures. Lena felt heat rise in her chest, but before she could respond, Cade's voice cut through the conversation like a blade. That's enough. He stepped into the cookhouse, his presence filling the small space with barely controlled fury. Sheriff, I appreciate your diligence, but these accusations are not only false, they're insulting to everyone involved. Cade, Adelaide began, I understand your natural inclination to defend someone you've grown fond of, but Timothy is my son, Cade said with deadly quiet. There's no question about that. Anyone with eyes can see the resemblance, and his knowledge of details about his mother proves his identity beyond doubt. But the letters, Hayes started. The letters that Miss Hart found were written by Maria Morales over a period of several years. They contain information that only Maria could have known, details about our time together that no outsider could have fabricated. Sheriff Morrison shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Mercer, I'm not questioning the boy's identity, but the suggestion is that Miss Hart may have manipulated the timing of these discoveries to create a situation where she would become indeterminate to both of you. Lena watched Cade's face as the implications sank in. Someone was suggesting that she had orchestrated Timothy's arrival, facilitated his acceptance into the family, and positioned herself as the perfect solution to their domestic needs. That's ridiculous, Cade said, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice that cut Lena deeper than any outright accusation could have. Because wasn't there a grain of truth in the allegations? Hadn't she felt herself hoping for exactly the kind of permanence and security Adelaide described? Hadn't she allowed herself to imagine a future here with this family that had no foundation in reality? Is it? Adelaide's voice was soft, almost gentle. Ask yourself honestly, Cade, isn't the timing convenient? This woman arrives just before a young man claiming to be your son appears on your doorstep. She immediately involves herself in his care, makes herself useful to both of you, and then conveniently discovers letters that prove his story and paint his deceased mother in the most sympathetic possible light. Each word was like a needle finding its mark, because even though Lena knew the accusations were based on lies and deliberate misrepresentation, she also knew how they must sound to an objective observer. Furthermore, Adelaide continued, has it occurred to you to wonder how those letters ended up hidden in a storage room that Miss Hart just happened to be cleaning? How convenient that she should discover them at exactly the moment when questions about Timothy's identity might become problematic. Because I hid them there, came a voice from the doorway. Everyone turned to see Mrs. Calloway, the elderly woman who ran the boarding house in town, standing in the entrance to the cookhouse. Her weathered face was set with the grim determination of someone who had decided to unburden herself of a long-carried secret. I beg your pardon, Sheriff Morrison said. Mrs. Calloway stepped into the room, her cane tapping against the wooden floor. I said I hid them letters. Been hiding them for 3 years ever since Maria Morales started sending them. The silence that followed was so complete that Lena could hear her own heartbeat. I run the boarding house, Mrs. Calloway continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was admitting. Mail comes through there sometimes when folks ain't sure of exact addresses. Them letters came addressed to Cade Mercer, but Mrs. Pritchard, she was always real interested in what mail came through town. Real interested in making sure certain folks didn't get messages that might complicate things. Adelaide's face had gone white, but her voice remained steady. Mrs. Calloway, I think you are confused. Why would I have any interest in Mr. Mercer's correspondence? The older woman fixed Adelaide with a look of profound disgust. Because you've been trying to get your hands on this ranch since before Sarah Mercer was cold in the ground. Been spreading your poison trying to convince Cade to sell out and move back east, trying to make him believe he wasn't cut out for this life. That's absurd. Is it? Mrs. Calloway reached into her coat and pulled out a thick envelope. Because I got your promises right here in writing. Your promises to split the commission when I helped you convince Cade to sell to your buyer in Chicago. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, his expression shifting from uncomfortable duty to intense interest. Mrs. Calloway, are you saying that Mrs. Pritchard offered to pay you to interfere with Mr. Mercer's mail? I'm saying she's been running a long game for 3 years trying to isolate that man and convince him he had nothing left worth staying for. When them letters started coming from Colorado, she knew they might change everything. So she paid me to make sure they never reached him. Adelaide's composure finally cracked. You can't prove any of this. These are the ravings of a bitter old woman who— I can prove it, Mrs. Calloway said grimly. I kept copies of every letter, every payment, every promise you made. Figured they might be insurance someday. The devastating silence that followed was broken only by the sound of rain beginning to fall, outside the storm finally breaking in fat drops that drummed against the cookhouse roof. Lena felt something inside her chest unclenching, a knot of fear and doubt that had been growing tighter with every accusation finally beginning to loosen. The truth was emerging, ugly and complicated, but still the truth. Timothy appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with running and his eyes wide with confusion. What's happening? Garrett said there were accusations. Cade moved to his son's side, his hand settling on Timothy's shoulder with protective certainty. It's all right. It's going to be all right. But Lena could see in Cade's face that nothing was all right, might never be all right again. Because even though her name had been cleared, even though the accusations against her had been revealed as part of a larger conspiracy, the damage had been done. The careful trust that had been building between them, the fragile hope for something more than professional cooperation had been shattered by doubt and suspicion, and the knowledge of how easily their relationship could be twisted into something mercenary. Sheriff Morrison was taking Mrs. Calloway's evidence, preparing to arrest Adelaide Pritchard for mail fraud and conspiracy. Hayes was being questioned about his role in the deception. The immediate crisis was being resolved, but Lena knew with devastating clarity that some things once broken could never be fully repaired. Miss Hart, Cade said quietly, and something in his voice made her look up despite herself. His eyes held apology and gratitude in a profound sadness that cut her more deeply than any accusation could have, because he was looking at her like someone saying goodbye. I'm sorry, he said simply, for all of this, for what it must have put you through. It's not your fault, Lena replied, though her voice sounded strange and distant to her own ears. Isn't it? I should have known. Should have questioned why Maria never contacted me, should have wondered what happened to the letters I knew she must have written. If I'd been paying attention, you couldn't have known what Adelaide was doing. Maybe not, but I should have trusted you more, should have dismissed the accusations without a moment's hesitation. The words were kind, but Lena could hear the careful distance in them, could see in his face the caution of a man who'd been reminded how easily good intentions could be misinterpreted, how quickly outside forces could corrupt something innocent. The boy, Adelaide said suddenly, her voice desperate as Sheriff Morrison prepared to escort her away. The boy is still illegitimate, still a bastard with no legal claim to anything. Even if the letters are real, they prove he was born out of wedlock. Think about what that means for your standing in the community. Timothy flinched at the cruel words, and Lena saw Cade's jaw tighten with rage. That boy, Cade said with deadly quiet, is my son in every way that matters. His legitimacy comes from my acknowledgement, not from the circumstances of his birth. And anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me personally. The fierce protectiveness in his voice made Lena's chest warm, despite everything else that was happening. Whatever damage Adelaide had done to other relationships, she hadn't succeeded in driving a wedge between father and son. But as Sheriff Morrison led Adelaide away and the crowd began to disperse, Lena felt the weight of changed circumstances settling around her like a shroud. The accusations had been disproven, her integrity had been established, but the underlying questions remained. What was she doing here? What did she hope to gain from staying? Was she really content to be just the cook, or had she been harboring hopes for something more? And if she had been hoping for more, what did that make her, Miss Hart? Timothy said quietly, appearing at her side as she began mechanically preparing the interrupted breakfast. Are you all right? I'm fine, honey. No, you're not. You look like someone died. Lena managed a weak smile. Just tired. It's been a difficult morning. But it's over now. The truth came out. Everyone knows you didn't do anything wrong. Yes, Lena agreed, though the word tasted like ash in her mouth. Everyone knows. Timothy studied her face with the perceptive gaze of someone who'd learned early to read the emotional currents in adult relationships. You're thinking about leaving, aren't you? The question hit her squarely in the chest, all the more devastating for its accuracy. Timothy, you are. I can see it in your face. You're thinking about moving on, finding another job somewhere else. Sometimes, Lena said carefully, it's better to leave before circumstances force you to go. What circumstances? Adelaide's been arrested. Her lies have been exposed. Everyone knows you're innocent. Everyone knows I'm not guilty of the specific things I was accused of, Lena corrected. That's not the same thing as being innocent. Timothy's confusion was evident in his face. I don't understand. How could she explain it? How could she make a 16-year-old boy understand that she had been guilty of the deeper crime? Adelaide had identified the crime of hoping for more than she deserved, of allowing herself to imagine a future that had never been offered to her. Sometimes, Lena said slowly, when people accuse you of wanting something, it forces you to examine whether they're right, whether you have been harboring feelings or expectations that you had no right to have. You mean about my father? It wasn't a question, and Lena felt heat flood her cheeks at Timothy's perceptive observation. I mean about all of this, she said carefully. About staying here, about being part of this family. I'm the cook, Timothy. I was hired to do a job for a specific period of time. Anything beyond that, anything more permanent, was just wishful thinking on my part. Timothy was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a maturity that seemed beyond his years. My mother spent 17 years loving someone she couldn't have, believing she'd given up her right to happiness because of choices she made when she was young and scared. Don't make the same mistake. The simple words hit Lena with devastating accuracy, cutting through all her careful rationalizations and defensive positioning to reach the heart of her fear. It's not that simple, she whispered. Love is always simple, Timothy said firmly. It's people who make it complicated. Before Lena could respond, Cade's voice called from the doorway. Timothy, could I have a word? Timothy squeezed Lena's hand once, then went to join his father. Through the window, Lena watched them walk together toward the main house, their heads bent close in serious conversation. They would be fine, she realized. Father and son had found each other, had learned to trust each other. Whatever challenges lay ahead for them, they would face them together. Which meant her work here was done. The thought should have brought relief, a sense of completion. Instead, it brought only a hollow ache and the familiar restlessness that meant it was time to pack her bags and find the next temporary position, the next family that had needed her skills until they no longer needed her at all. By evening, the storm had passed, leaving the air clean and cool and full of the scent of rain-washed earth. Lena sat on the cookhouse steps, watching the sun break through the departing clouds in shafts of golden light that painted the ranch buildings in warm amber tones. It was beautiful here, peaceful in a way that made her chest ache with longing for things she couldn't name. But beauty and peace weren't enough to build a life on, especially when that life would always be lived on the periphery of someone else's story. Mind if I join you? Lena looked up to find Cade standing at the bottom of the steps, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes holding something that might have been regret. It's your ranch, she said quietly. He settled beside her, leaving a careful distance between them that spoke volumes about the changed nature of their relationship. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "No, you don't." "I do. I should have dismissed Adelaide's accusations immediately. Should have known you better than to give them even a moment's consideration." Lena was quiet for a long moment, watching the play of light across the mountains. "Should you have known me better? I mean, I thought I did. We've known each other for 3 weeks, Cade. 3 weeks of professional interaction and shared concern for Timothy. That's not really enough time to know someone's character. It was enough time for me to trust you with my son. That's different. That was about my qualifications, my experience with young people. It wasn't about personal things. Wasn't it?" Cade turned to look at her directly. "Because I trusted you with more than just cooking and cleaning, Lena. I trusted you with the most important thing in my world." The simple statement hit her squarely in the chest, warming places she'd been trying to keep carefully protected. "Timothy would be fine without me," she said quietly. "He's strong and he has you now. He doesn't need me to take care of him anymore." "Maybe not, but that doesn't mean we don't want you to." The words hung into the evening air between them, weighted with possibility and hope, and all the things Lena had been telling herself not to feel. "Want isn't enough," she said finally. "Want leads to expectations, and expectations lead to disappointment. I've learned that lesson enough times to know better than to ignore it. What if it wasn't just want? What if it was more than that?" Lena's breath caught in her throat. "Cade, I know the timing is terrible. I know Adelaide's accusations have complicated everything. But I need you to know that what I feel for you has nothing to do with gratitude or convenience or any of the ugly motives she suggested." "Then what does it have to do with—" Cade was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the last rays of sunlight were fading into purple dusk. "It has to do with the way you hum when you're cooking, the way you listen to Timothy like everything he says matters. The way you make this place feel like a home instead of just a house where I sleep between workdays." Each word was like a stone thrown into the still water of Lena's carefully guarded heart, creating ripples that spread outward until she couldn't contain them anymore. "It has to do with the fact that I wake up each morning but looking forward to whatever small conversation we might have over coffee, that I find myself timing my visits to the cookhouse just to watch you work. That for the first time in 3 years, I can imagine a future that involves more than just surviving from one day to the next." Lena felt tears prick at her eyes, but she forced herself to remain practical. "What you're describing sounds like gratitude, Cade. Appreciation for someone who's helped you through a difficult time. That's not love." "No," he agreed quietly. "That's not love." He turned to face her fully, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "Love is what I feel when I watch you teach Timothy to make bread, so patient with his mistakes, so proud of his successes. Love is the way my chest tightens when you smile, the way I find myself planning excuses just to spend time in your company." Lena's breath caught in her throat. "Cade, please. Love is knowing that if you leave here tomorrow, I'll spend the rest of my life regretting that I didn't tell you how I feel, that I didn't ask you to stay, that I didn't fight for the chance to build something real with someone who makes me remember what it feels like to be fully alive." The words hung in the air between them, like a bridge spanning the careful distance they'd been maintaining and offering a connection that terrified Lena with its possibility. "You don't know what you're asking," she whispered. "I'm asking you to take a chance, to believe that what we have is worth the risk of being hurt, to trust that love can be stronger than fear." "I'm not the kind of woman men build futures with," Lena said, the words torn from some deep wounded place inside her. "I'm the kind of woman who gets passed over, who gets dismissed, who gets tolerated as long as she's useful. I know what I am, Cade. I know what I'm worth." The anguish in her voice seemed to cut through him like a blade. He reached for her hands, covering them with his own. "You're wrong," he said fiercely. "You're the kind of woman who makes everything around her better just by being there. You're the kind of woman who loves without condition, who gives without expecting anything in return. You're the kind of woman I want to spend the rest of my life learning to deserve." Lena felt her carefully constructed walls crumbling under the force of his words, hope flooding through the cracks like water through a breaking dam. "What about the community? What will people say when the widowed rancher takes up with his cook? Let them say whatever they want. The people whose opinions matter will judge us by our actions, not by gossip. And the people whose opinions don't matter, well, they don't matter. And Timothy, what if he feels like I'm trying to replace his mother? Cade smiled, the expression transforming his entire face. Timothy suggested I proposed to you 3 days ago. Apparently, he's tired of watching us circle around each other like nervous horses. The revelation hit Lena like a physical blow. He what? He said, and I quote, "If you don't marry Miss Hart, I'm going to lock you both in the storage room until you come to your senses." He may be young, but he's not blind. He knows what this is. Lena felt laughter bubble up from somewhere deep in her chest, surprising in its intensity. That boy, that boy wants a family, Lena, a real family, and he wants you to be part of it. As do I, Cade continued softly, more than I've ever wanted anything in my life. Lena looked at this man who had somehow seen past her size, her history, her expectations of rejection, and found something worth fighting for. She thought about the letters hidden for 3 years, about Maria's dying wish that had finally found its fulfillment despite every obstacle. She thought about the power of love to transcend time and distance and the small, cruel people who would stand in its way. Most of all, she thought about Timothy's words. Love is always simple. It's people who make it complicated. I'm scared, she admitted quietly. So am I. What if we're wrong? What if this is just gratitude and proximity and the relief of not being alone anymore? What if it's not? What if it's what it feels like? Lena met his eyes, seeing in them all the hope and fear and desperate longing she felt echoing in her own chest. What does it feel like to you, she whispered. Like coming home, Cade said simply. Like finding something I didn't even know I'd been searching for. The words broke the last of her resistance. Love, she realized, wasn't about being perfect or worthy or meeting some external standard of acceptability. Love was about recognition, about finding someone who saw you clearly and chose you anyway. Yes, she said, the word barely audible. Yes. Yes, I'll stay. Yes, I'll take the chance. Yes, I'll marry you if that's what you're asking. The smile that spread across Cade's face was like sunrise, bright enough to chase away every shadow that had lingered in Lena's heart. He lifted her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. That's exactly what I'm asking. They sat together in the gathering darkness, hands linked, hearts finally aligned, while around them the ranch settled into evening quiet. From the main house, warm light spilled from the window. Duz and Lena could see Timothy's silhouette moving around inside, probably preparing for bed. Tomorrow there would be plans to make a wedding, to arrange a future to build together. There would be challenges and doubts, and probably more interference from people who didn't understand what they'd found in each other. But tonight, sitting on the cookhouse steps with Cade's hand warm in hers, Lena allowed herself to believe that love really could be stronger than fear. That some chances were worth taking even when the outcome was uncertain. That some families were worth fighting for even when they didn't look like anything the world expected to see. And as if summoned by her thoughts, Timothy's voice called softly from the house. Are you coming in? I made coffee, and I want to show you both something I've been working on. Lena looked at Cade, seeing her own wonder reflected in his face. They were being called home by a boy who had chosen them as surely as they had chosen each other. Family, she thought as they rose to answer Timothy's call, wasn't always about blood or law or social convention. Sometimes it was about recognition, about finding the people who saw you clearly and loved you anyway, about having the courage to say yes when life offered you something beautiful and imperfect and real. Walking toward the house with Cade's hand in hers, Lena felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time in her adult life, she was moving towards something instead of away from it. For the first time, she was choosing to stay. And it felt exactly like coming home. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey across the Wyoming territory, where love proved stronger than prejudice, where family found a way to heal across time and distance, and where second chances led to something beautiful and lasting. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage and redemption, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support means everything to me, and I love reading about how these tales of frontier love resonate with people from all walks of life. Until next time, remember that the best love stories are the ones where people choose each other, not despite their flaws, but because of the beauty they see in each other's imperfect hearts.